Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Arsenal Pass episode 115. This week, we're going to be doing a mailbag questions from you all that have been submitted on Discord, Twitter, and YouTube, because I will actually be traveling to Scotland here on Monday. We're recording this on Saturday, 6/17. But yeah, a lot of good questions. I want to lead it off, Hayden. Of course, I know we did it pretty recently, but how's been your week in flesh and blood outside of that Singapore win? You've been playing any more? Taking a little break? What's going on?
Well, I didn't win Singapore, unfortunately. Top 8, though.
That counts as a win in my heart.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, Nationals is probably the next event that we've got to look forward to. Apart from, of course, Dust to Dawn release, we've got these great War of the Monarch events. But Nationals, War of the Monarch, both booster draft for Monarch. So got in a Monarch draft this week. It's the first time I've drafted Monarch in at least a year, if not close to 2 years, I think. So really cool to revisit that format. It's a set that I was talking with a couple of friends locally. It's a set that I didn't have fond memories of. I thought that the draft format wasn't that great. But revisiting it actually post Outsiders and Uprising, I think my kind of thoughts on it has changed a bit. It is quite a deep format, actually, even if I do have some problems with the gameplay. It feels a little bit more bomby than some formats that we've had recently, just because of the power level of some cards, particularly power level, how Prism decks can turn out. The ceilings on decks can be really high, but the floors can be really low. So, look, it's a really interesting format. I enjoyed my draft. I drafted, I got kind of put into a Prism seat, drafted an okay Prism deck, went 2-1. And yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it. So I'm definitely going to be doing a lot of drafting for Monarch. We'll probably do some Monarch draft-based content. Going to look to put, I know people have been asking for, we did a Welcome to Wraith intro to sort of 101 video for Welcome to Wraith draft. Going to try and put something out similar for Monarch in the next week and a half. So that's really high on my priority list for people who are asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we've talked about it before. I'm definitely a fan of the draft format. I do agree on the power level disparity of some decks, right? You know, there are some offending cards like Via the Vanguard and, like you said, with some of the Prism decks. But ultimately,
Soul Reaping.
Yeah, I mean, that card is... Do you think that card is better or worse than Via the Vanguard?
I think on the aggregate, it's not quite as bad. I don't say worse because I think these cards are so good, but Via the Vanguard, I think, can just lead to the craziest decks, I think, in Bolton. My kind of perception is that Bolton is like one of the highest ceilings in this draft format, and Via the Vanguard, Gallantry Gold, Spilled Blood, like these are the cards that allow you to do that. So I think Via the Vanguard, like if for some reason I had a foil and a non-foil of these two cards in my pack, I think I'd take the Via the Vanguard, but like that's something I need to reassess with like my pick orders and stuff like that. Yeah. I also think Chain is maybe slightly less drafted in previous formats, but that might change. I mean, the people who are going to be playing Monarch Draft, for like 70-80% of people, they've never drafted Monarch before. You know what I mean? So it's going to be an all new, like it is going to be an all new format, which is super interesting. So
I also think back when we used to draft Chain in Monarch, the concept of pitch stacking with Chain was, I mean, obviously people knew you could do it, but it was just less popularized. The Riftbind endgame wasn't really a thing. I mean, that was really brought to light during Constructed. So despite, like I said, people knew about it back then, but I do think that coming into a Monarch draft in the modern era, people will be playing a lot more Chain. I think that was maybe a prohibitively hard hero to play back in the day. So I think it's still hard to play. I mean, I famously went 3-0, or some people like to call it 0-3 in a team draft, playing Chain. But I do think we'll see a lot more people drafting that hero specifically, especially because people are so fond of it after these few eras of Class Constructed since our boy's Living Legend.
We're not going to see pods with 2 shadow heroes, I don't think. Like it's going to be a lot more balanced. I think people are going to take... Also, people have learned a lot. People as the sort of the aggregate of player bases just has a higher skill level when it comes to Flesh and Blood draft. People are going to take things they learned from the previous 2 formats in Uprising and, I mean, even Tales of Aria, but Uprising and then into Outsiders and bring that to the approach to Monarch draft. And I'm really excited to see how people approach it. Players who maybe went around when Monarch was a format, this is their first time drafting it, but they're some of the higher level players in the world. I'm excited to see how they approach it. What are their kind of thoughts? So I really hope we see, it's kind of odd because we're only going to really see nationals. So maybe I'm really kind of hoping we see some people, put their thoughts out there, whether it be Twitter, whether it be some content about how they approach this draft format, because it is quite deep. I mean, you've got 4 heroes, you've got the 2 talent system. There's a lot of ways to stay potentially open. There's actually archetypes. Just, revisiting, we had sort of these mini archetypes in Outsiders. We didn't really have archetypes in Uprising outside of just what the heroes did. Monarch actually has archetypes.
Yes.
You take Levia, for instance, you've got at minimum 3 or 4 archetypes in that hero, which is quite cool.
Mm-hmm. Hey, do you have any news for us this week? I want to start off with some non-flesh and blood news because it is a bit of a meme on the podcast. There was now a restaurant called Pastor. Well, Pastor actually just closed, which is devastating because we never got to go, Hayden and I, with our friend Sasha Markovic. Unfortunately, the owner, something happened in the family, so they decided to close the restaurant. Which is honestly, it's some of the worst news I've heard in a long time. I'm devastated, Hayden. I really wanted to join you at Pastor.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been separately. We just didn't get the chance to go together. So we'll find a new restaurant for us to all visit together.
You know what's funny? I got multiple. So I'm in a group chat with Hayden and some other people. I got multiple messages on Facebook Messenger about Pastor closing. And then I had friends from like college DM me about it being closed. I like woke up to this full phone of messages about Pastor closing. It's just like savage. Anyway, back to Flesh and Blood.
Back to Flesh and Blood. I mean, we kind of covered the news this week. As Brendan said, we're recording a few days removed from the last podcast dropping. I know one thing that has sort of piqued people's interest is we've seen a couple of more preview cards. So we saw some light cards. I don't know if you saw these, Brendan, these light warrior cards that we just saw. These kind of, they're really interesting to me. So if you haven't seen these are the Banneret cards you can go to. I mean, what I use, I go to good old Fabry, and they have a little Dust to Dawn sort of preview spoiler section. These are the cards that kind of stood out to me. Yeah, these Banneret of Courage, of Gallantry, of Protection, and then also Resilience, Salvation, and Vigor. What's going to be interesting, we only saw promo versions of these cards, so whether these have full cycles, but they do have this new keyword for us, which is called Soul Flare, which basically, when these cards are charged, they give you a perk. So some of these make tokens, like quicken tokens, etc. Some of them are like gain a life, gain a resource. These are the kind of cards, Brendan, I think that Bolton has been looking for. When you charge a card, you get no value off the card. So for these Banneret cards, though, when you charge them, you get value off the card, which I think is the sort of thing, you go down a card in Light Warrior at the moment with Bolton's charge ability, whereas with these, you're going to get at least some value of that card back, not just to go again off it in the future. So yeah, these cards are cool. The rate on them, whether we get a cycle of them, whether they're yellows, I mean, if they're a full cycle, we might have seen all of the Light Warrior cards already, which is interesting. But yeah, it's cool that we're now seeing, we haven't, since Monarch, since Tales of Aria, when these heroes first released, these talented heroes, we haven't seen talented cards come out for them. These supplemental sets have stayed away from talents, right? They've just been purely the class-based cards for the most part. And now this time we're going to see, talent cards.
It's funny because we've seen this treatment before. We actually saw it on some Prism cards back in Everfest. Prism cards, Phantasm, they break and it's supposed to be only downside, right? We saw some Illusionist cards get added with Phantasm to the card pool that actually gave you an additional upside when that card was popped as well. So now we're seeing that happen in Bolton too. I think it had, I don't know if it had as much of an impact on Prism because Prism was already so fundamentally powerful and got these zero cost auras, which is really sort of the motif of that set. But like you said with Bolton previously, charging a card was just net downside. I mean, you would obviously stack up the soul and use it at a later point in the game, but adding this effect to charge, I think, is a huge upgrade for a class or a hero that specifically suffered from what seemed to be just consistent card disadvantage, right?
Yeah, famously, Brendan, the best card from Everfest, here is where I'm going with it, Coalescing Mirage. I mean, that was the best.
Yeah. Okay, so I was a little high on that card for a bit, let's not get into it. It's a rabbit hole.
I'm just having you on.
Yeah.
Last thing I did want to point out, though, is really cool. I mean, LSS have given this opportunity to IGN, which is very cool. So IGN actually dropped United We Stand. If you haven't seen this, it's a light action attack. Costs 3, attacks for 6, defense for 2. It's a majestic. And I mean, the art, first of all, this art is going to be like marquee art for some time to come. It has Bravo, Briar, Lexi, Prism, Dorinthia, Bolton, Ultim. It's the I guess what might be considered the light side or the good side of a potential battle for the Monarch. So very, very cool. In terms of what it does, it has Unity keyword. You can go and check it out. I'm not going to read it all. Basically, it has Unity, and it gives tokens based on what you which hero is in your party. So the biggest point is that PvE is coming, right? This is a set that clearly is going to start to set up for PvE. We've been saying it for multiple sets now. We see Unity, we see a keyword just that is, really targeted towards, it's going to be seen in 1v1 play, but also this keyword clearly, especially with a card like United We Stand, PvE, right? So
Yeah.
people are pretty hyped.
The video was really good as well. I gotta give credit to LSS over the past year. It does look like their marketing initiatives have definitely gone up, right? I think it's actually largely due to the new hire or just rearranging of Alex Norville. He's quite a little hustler. He's been pushing for a lot of this. I know as content creators, we recently received a content creator package. The one with the mat, it had the tokens, it had the dice. Like, I mean, they've been upping their game, which has been good to see. Good to see for sure, and I saw that in the video in which IDN displayed, which was pretty badass, to be honest.
Yeah, it had voice acting. I think it was done with 3 floating, which is those guys have been doing some really cool sort of gameplay content and things like that. And I think this is interesting. The sort of the preview season for Dusk Till Dawn seems unlike anything we've seen before. I guess we can kind of say this. Like, we haven't been approached about previewing a card, and from what I understand, Brennan, a lot of creators that have previously previewed cards also haven't. So whether they're doing this quite late in the piece or they're going to just do this preview season completely differently, which, by the way, I have no problem with. If they're going to take a completely different approach, I'm all okay with this. I think it's a great way to do something a little bit different every season. They're reaching out to like 60-70% of the same people to preview these cards. If they're going to take a completely different approach, I'm fine for us not to get a preview card this season if it's going to mean a completely different way to reveal the set. I think it's going to be very cool.
Yeah, I'm also fine with that. Receiving our first preview card was probably one of the coolest experiences I had in TCGs.
Yeah.
Actually, when we got to open the Everfest pack, that was
cool.
That was
Crown
unique.
of Providence?
Yeah. Crown of Providence. Well, so Crown of Providence was pretty badass, right? Because we got to be right about a card, and everybody else was wrong. But with Everfest, we got to open an entire pack, and seeing all the new cards, that felt really cool. But ultimately, I think that preview cards, I'm super happy to show love on that and pass up on them for a few seasons and let them, if they find a better strategy for it, I'm all for it. Anyway, Hayden, Command and Cookout section. The entire pod is a Command and Cookout section. But if you want to get your questions submitted for next week's episode, you can choose to comment on YouTube, on Twitter, or go to the Arsenal Pass Discord, and there is a channel specifically for that. All right, Hayden, I'm going to go ahead and steal this, and I'm going to ask the first question. And my question is, what do you think PvE is going to be? There's been a lot of iterations of PvE in card games in the past. How do you think Fab will ultimately structure its PvE?
Great question. I mean, the simple answer is I have no freaking clue. I think the more complex answer is I think they have to make it feel natural with how Flesh and Blood plays. So if you're a player who enjoys playing Flesh and Blood, whether it be casually, whether it be semi-competitively, maybe even competitively, it needs to feel natural to walk into a game of PvE and feel like you can probably almost transition the class and the hero that you play with a few tweaks here and there to be able to play PvE versus being able to go down to your local armory and just play CC or Blitz, for instance, right? I think that's the first kind of challenge for LSS. In terms of what the campaigns, the game itself looks like, I mean, you've seen it done, like you say, in so many different ways. I think one of the ways that I've really enjoyed is where you've seen CCGs do it. So, or LCGs, living card games, rather. So things like Arkham Horror, the LCG, things like the Lord of the Rings LCG as well. I think these are really interesting ways to do it where, you kind of play through these campaigns. You have these packs that come out that effectively give you the campaigns to play through as a group. I think that's probably, as opposed to maybe the more board gamey route we've seen previously, where it's like you just have certain scenarios and you can buy expansion packs and stuff. I think that probably won't fit quite the mold that LSS want to go after. It just doesn't really fit, I think, what a TCG is and what PvE in a TCG could look like. So, look, this is going to be really unique. We haven't seen a true competitive TCG really do PvE before. We've seen multiplayer, obviously, but yeah. So I think it's going to be, either way, it's going to be groundbreaking. It's going to be sort of potentially industry defining how they go about this. Yeah,
when I think about PvE in a game like Flesh and Blood, I probably think about WoW TCG first, and the way they did raids and things like that. I guess it is a pretty tough question, right? Because we have no clue. I don't know if you were ever able to play the car game or whatever it was that they had back at like the early callings. But ultimately, do you think that PvE will be a fun and fulfilling experience, or do you think it will have? Do you think you'll get the sentiment that it was more developed as an afterthought, as a response to sort of community desire, and maybe not be as flushed out? What do you think the final product is gonna resemble?
I think if it did look like that, like if it was an afterthought, if it's something that was just purely driven by demand, it'd already be out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like they would have already just released it and said, "Here, have this. This is a half-baked kind of thing." But that's clearly not what they're doing. They've frustrated people with the time it's taken to release this product because they want to get it right. They want to make sure that the card base is there. They want to make sure that, the pool's available. They have the right product, I think. We might not even get PvE with the set, right? That is the other thing worth considering. We're seeing Unity cards. This could just be yet another set that's setting us up for PvE. Maybe we get a standalone PvE product which introduces this in a sort of lull period. But I think the main thing, PvE needs to tie into lore. This game has the potential to have really strong lore. We've seen it in patches, I would say. It's not been a consistent thing. But I think if you're playing PvE, my kind of understanding from talking to a lot of people and understanding about what PvE looks like to them or could look like to them is these people are quite invested in what the lore could look like. They're really attached to heroes. They're really attached to the kind of the background of the game. These are the people, I think, that are sitting there and they're deciphering the codes on the art of cards to work out what, the glyphs say, for instance. I think PvE has to be really lore based because it has to bring you into this world of effectively, playing this campaign out, playing what it feels like with friends, D&D-esque, like RPG-esque. Yes. I think that is one of the strengths that a hero-based TCG has and what LSS have developed. So they have to translate that into what PvE could look like in an even stronger way than what we've seen with 1v1.
One of the most important things to me when it comes to PvE in a card game like this is that it's actually difficult. There's a game called Regicide that was created by our friend Luke Badger, and that game is legitimately difficult to play. You'll see people playing it on the side of at tables at tournaments. I saw people playing at the Pro Tour. It's a fun little side game to bring to a major event. But that game is really tough, and people need to know what they're doing, and you have to collaborate. And it's you have this replayability through the difficulty. And I hope that Flesh and Blood is able to deliver an experience like that, something that has replayability because it is hard, right? Because the issue with PvE, and especially with cooperative PvE, is that you run into this scenario where sometimes the path of least resistance or the path of success is that the best player becomes the sort of omnipotent player of all hands, right? And sort of dictates what all the players are doing. And it's important to find a way through game design to sort of mitigate that. Sometimes it's done through time, or sometimes it's done through the inherent setup of it. Like with Regicide, right? We're all kind of looking at this somewhat hidden information. So for me, that's the most important part. Like I want to be able to take this to a Pro Tour, sit down with players that are at that level of an event, and maybe have a 15-20 minute game where we go and try to conquer some sort of boss or something like that. That could be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
on board.
Yeah. On to our first question here. So this comes from YouTube. This is from Justin Talby 4255, and they say, I've got a question for the Command and Cookout. For the intermediate 1 to 2 year player, maybe they've top 8 at a Road to National, maybe they go positive at Armies, but haven't been able to hit the next level. What are some of the biggest things that player should be looking at in terms of their gameplay? It's me, by the way. I'm the intermediate player. I'll let you take this one, Hayden.
Well, great question, Justin. I think first of all, it's a really big question. I think, it's really hard. I think this might frustrate people, but and Justin even, and maybe as well, it can be super contextual on your play. And I think it's really hard for me to nail things down without watching you play a game, for instance. But I think some of the things that I see repeatedly, my experience with playing people at Road to Nationals, players that are maybe just on the cusp, they're maybe just getting to the top 8, they're not quite getting to the top 4, or they're maybe just getting to the player that Justin's explaining, basically, this intermediate player. I think some of the continual sort of downfalls I see and things that people need to look at and improve on in their gameplay. One of them is definitely understanding their role in a game. So in any given matchup with the deck they're playing, what is their role? And we've talked about this a lot, but it's like, how do you win games? I consistently see people maybe have a vague idea of this, but realistically, they don't nail down exactly how they're going to win a game. And so when they get into the mid to late game, they make decisions that aren't in their best interest. They make decisions that on the face of it might be value orientated because maybe they're at an intermediate level and they've understood how to understand or extrapolate value from any given turn cycle, but they might not progress towards how they win a game. And I can give like an example of this, right? You're playing into, let's say you're you just played against Ultim, right? Ultim's been so dominant in this format. You're playing Lexi against Ultim, and you know that, the way you win this game is to not get fatigued. But you get into the end game and you kind of forget about this, and you spy an opportunity to deal some damage. And in the mid game, you like pop your Snapdragon Scalers for an extra like 2 to 3 damage. In the in game, could that Snapdragon Scaler's been worth like 6, 7 damage, for instance? And I think those are the sorts of things that I see people make mistakes about because they misunderstand the point of the game they're at. They misunderstand the way they're going to win the game. And that ultimately leads to quite a lot of losses, I think, that people can't identify. It's really hard to identify those. But I think the way that you fix those issues and then you start to identify those is you think about the way you're going to win the game. You try and understand the context of a matchup. And it's a really big task. It's not an easy thing to do, I think. And in terms of how do you go about this and how do you get better at this? Like, what are the kind of practical ways? There's no one solution, but I think if you keep in your mind and you talk to your friends, you talk to the players, you talk to people you play games against, you talk in armories, you talk in road to nationals with players who are better than you after the game, and you try and sit down and identify with them, hey, where do you think I lost that game? Where do you think the point is where I went wrong in that game? And you're going to get some feedback. Like, people will be able to tell you, like, I use that specific example because I saw that multiple times in road to nationals, and I was able to tell people that, if they asked me that question, hey, where do you think I lost that game? Well, I think one of the big things is you did this on this turn, or, there was a turn where you decided to throw a rain razors, even though you knew you were only going to be able to play 2 arrows in that turn, for instance. So these sorts of things. I mean, there's so many more, Brendan, but I think that one is particularly big, and I saw it a lot during this road to national season.
Yeah, I think I have a pretty straightforward answer to this, and I'm quite confident in it. And I believe the biggest difference or the biggest limiter to intermediate players and what's stopping them from becoming high level or expert players is the people that they surround themselves with. I think that if you surround yourselves with the right group of players, any player can become high level, can become a high level player, can become a pro tour competitor, can become a world competitor, even threaten top 8. Look at someone like Zach Bunn. Pretty average, no, but even Zach Bunn can top 8 at calling when he surrounds himself with something like the Wolfpack. Like, I know from my personal experience, being able to test with people like Hayden and Sasha consistently allowed me to get better at the game at such a faster rate than I would have if I was alone or if I'd siloed myself. And it's the greatest contributor to any success that I had. And I genuinely believe that through mentorship and through surrounding yourself with players that are better than you, or at least willing to engage with you and learn, is how you become a great player of flesh and blood. I think 99.9% of players fall under this sort of category of having done that or are currently doing that, where there is maybe a gross 0.001% outlier that have maybe been the one player that can do it on their own. I genuinely believe it's the people you surround yourself with.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's all about the learnings and advancing, right? And it's like learning any skill in life. Some of the best ways to learn is to get feedback and to understand exactly what the areas you can work on are. And you can't see your mistakes often, but other people can. And that's why I think our 2 points actually tie really closely together. Yeah. I think you talked about specifically, you said about surrounding yourself with those players. I mean, it's not always practical to do that, right? Maybe you haven't been able to find a testing group that benefits you, but something you can do is when you go to these events, it's experience. Like when you go to callings, like get yourself to callings and then you play against someone that you think is better than you for whatever reason. Maybe you felt like you got outplayed, maybe the player, they're a top player. Just ask them these questions, have a couple of questions, like try and learn from them. If you're going to go to a calling level event, for instance, for the experience, like make sure you get the experience out of it. And one of the best ways to do that is, asking questions, finding out, try and get feedback to kind of Brendan's point. And then I think beyond that, if you can surround yourself, maybe you've got a player maybe you've got like this, bitter rival, someone that you're always fighting for the 3-hour armories with. Why not try and learn together? Maybe they're also clearly a very good player. They're at the same sort of similar level as you. Why not try and bounce ideas off that person and try and improve each other together? So, there's a lot of ways you can do it, I think.
Yeah, I genuinely believe it's rising tides. People get better together. All right, the next one is from Jake the Rake 3. They say, Hayden, I'd love to hear more about what contributes to your 7 to 9.5 confidence levels. This is in regards to the Calling Singapore. I'm newer to Fab, and while I understand sports preparing physically and mentally, Fab has a degree of luck versus skill, matchup selection, etc. that seems hard to prepare for. What do you do that gives you such an advantage at every event? It's impressive.
Thanks, Jake. Just to point out there, I have not cashed every event. There's definitely been events where I've had poor results. Like there was a run, Brendan knows this, we talked about it a lot afterwards about how to try and avoid the situation, but I went from Singapore last year to Lille to my national championships, and I felt like underperformed. I think we all made day two at Lille, Brendan, but I don't think any of us cashed in the end at Lille. Singapore I didn't cash, and then my nationals ended up like bubbling out of top 8. I felt like this run was not,
Yeah.
So there's a lot to learn from that, which I can definitely talk about.
Do you remember the answer too? Do you remember the specific answer that we discussed to what we attributed a lot of the inconsistency to?
So there's a couple of things to that one, like to that kind of bad run. One was like the preparation wasn't the right preparation for me. I felt, landed on a deck late, didn't understand matchups, things that Jake just talked about. Preparation wasn't there really, I think. Even to a degree, like mentally, I didn't feel in the best position because I didn't feel prepared. That kind of led into one into the other. And then the other was, I think, choosing to play a style of deck that I felt didn't give me the agency that I wanted, whether it's perceived or realized agency that I felt like I needed to compete and leverage what I see as my skills. So in terms of this like question Jake asked, so the kind of context to this for people who maybe have missed some of the pods or didn't hear, because they're quite small questions that Brendan asked me. A couple of weeks ago before Singapore, Brendan asked like, what was my confidence level? And I was like, maybe it's like a 7. And then we got off the call and I said to him, I was like, actually, maybe it's like an 8. I think it might be an 8. And then the week of, I was thinking it was like a 9.5. And I guess the reason for this was just the preparation, especially in the last 2 weeks, was, I think, really strong. I got the ability to do something that Jake talks about, which is, matchup selection is quite a hard thing. I got to play against a lot of the different matchups that I was worried about. I felt like I solved a lot of the matchups I was worried about in terms of my plans. I felt really confident. And then this idea that Jake says is like, Fab has a degree of luck versus skill. And that is definitely true. The matchups, what do you call it, Brendan? You call it the gym sort of pairings.
Gym
what are your
format,
gym pairings? Yeah, the gym format. Like that is definitely true. But one way that you can mitigate that is give yourself the most amount of positive matchups by choosing the right deck, right? And having the right plans. So going to Singapore, it was like, I didn't really want to dodge anything that wasn't Kano and control dash. And I was like, how much of that is the field going to be? Maximum 10%. So, I'm giving myself like a 90%, first of all, pairing rate that I want to see or that I'm okay with seeing. That's a good start. More than that, probably like a 40 to 50% of the field that I actively wanted to see. I wanted to play into Lexi's. I wanted to play into mirror matches. Those are the matchups I want to play all day, every day. Azuri's, I wanted to play those 3 matchups all day, every day. Even Dromai, I was like, give me those matchups. So I think that is part of why my 9.5 is there. And then I guess this kind of, again, idea of like luck versus skill, you can, to a degree, I think, eliminate a lot of the luck by the deck you choose. So I chose a deck that has like a really low variance, for instance, and also that deck's in a really good position. In previous formats, I've definitely chosen decks that have higher degrees of variance, but have a higher ceiling, higher level of power. Kano at Worlds, for instance, I think is that to a degree. But still, the big confidence value for me going into Worlds, for instance, was preparation. So I think it's a hard one to answer succinctly because it's a tough question when it comes to consistency. Like, how do you extrapolate consistency? But I think for me, I found a formula that works, which is understand the meta, what I think the meta is going to be in any given event, find the deck that I think is probably going to be best positioned for that, just based on the power level of what it is and also its matchup spread, and then learn every matchup, solve matchups, find slightly creative things that could attack a matchup in a different way than people are expecting, and just understand it inside and out, and bring that deck to the event.
Yeah. So what I can contribute to this is over our years of playing, because we did play together 4 years, was
a lot.
We would consistently go back to is like we were refining our process the entire time. So every failure we had, whether it was a legitimate failure or sort of a micro failure, we would tend to revisit the process and try to figure out what we had done wrong there. I mean, because the key thing, sorry for the stuttering, is to not be too results oriented, right? Because sometimes you do get unlucky. Sometimes things don't go your way. But it's to look back at your preparation and the way you approach the event and try to tweak that process for the future, right? So at Lille specifically, one thing we honed in on is like, we just didn't play enough games, right? Pretty much everybody sitting at that table prior to the event was like, okay, I think this deck might be a good deck for the tournament. I think that we've landed on a decent list, even though it's very last minute, but none none of us felt comfortable on the deck. None of us had enough reps, and we don't really attribute that to a failure on the day, but we look back at the process, the testing process, and we're like, we need to lock in this deck earlier because we need to get reps on it. We need to be playing the deck. We need to be comfortable with the deck. We need to have game plans into this stuff, because that's almost equally, if not more important than having the correct deck list, is having the correct game plans. So revisiting that process, we appoint we might move to appointing someone to take more of a leadership role in the testing group overall, so we have clear direction, right? Because sometimes we would fall into this area where, people, maybe they weren't testing, they were just kind of playing games to play games, and we want to avoid those scenarios and try to make a better use of our time. So it's all about revisiting that process. How can we hone it in, and what are we going to change for the future? And ultimately, I think that a lot of success in Fab is focusing on the process and not the results, but we do use the results as a way to try to litmus test our process. Is it working? Is it not?
There's a lot of that, I think, and particularly in limited in this game as well. I think people see limited as, I want to share a bit of an anecdote as well about luck in a second, but I think people see luck as such a big part of limited. And my kind of counter to that as well, if I'm super prepared for the limited format, I understand how to play all the archetypes. I understand what I want my decks to look like. I understand where my pick orders are. I'm going to drive that myself and eliminate a lot of that sort of luck element, the kind of variance element, because I'm going to know what I want these decks to look like. I'm going to know how I want to navigate drafts, and I'm going to set myself up in the best way possible to be super confident going into my games and get every single possible bit of edge I can in my games. I'm just going to win a lot more than others are. And I think that was my biggest learning on limited. I think it's why I went 6-0 at Worlds, for instance, in limited. I think it's why I went 5-0 in Nationals. I think it's what has kind of helped contribute to those things.
All right, next one. Go ahead.
I want to just make real quick on luck, because I think people talk a lot about. Would you agree? People talk a lot about luck and variance in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, and it's a funny conversation because Flesh and Blood is probably the TCG where that is the least. The factor is weighted the least. Slower. But yeah, I mean it's a clear and obvious and cop out, and the fastest way to make sure you never grow from anything is to blame things on luck. Go ahead, Hayden.
I want to share like a mindset shift that I'd love people to make in this game. Mind shift. It's a new card coming in the next set. Yeah. I think if you want to make a really positive mindset shift in Flesh and Blood to help you get better at this game, Brendan, do you know who Darren Brown is, Brendan?
Have you heard
of Darren Brown before? Okay, Darren Brown is I guess a magician, like a mentalist, a tricks of the mind kind of person, and he does this amazing special. He does like a lot of TV shows in the UK and stuff. And like 10 years ago, he did this amazing special, which was called I think it's called The Secret of Luck, basically. And he finds these people who basically think they're like the unluckiest people. They're like, I'm super unlucky. I'm so unlucky. I have the worst luck, right? And they get a camera crew to follow these people. And in particular, I think there's this guy named like Wayne the Butcher. I don't know. He's sounds like he's a murderer. He's literally a butcher. And his name's Wayne. He's like, I'm super unlucky. I'm so unlucky. And they follow him around with a crew, right? And they put all these things in his way. Like they put $100 note, $100 note on the ground. They put up this big sign that says like, get this free or something, or like, Wayne, do this and you'll get this or something. Like these are massive, like it gets less and less subtle as you go along through like the kind of week as they follow him. They give all these chances for him to basically have lucky encounters, right? And he takes none of them. He gets none of them, basically. I think maximum one. He doesn't see the pound note, or he doesn't pick it up. He doesn't even look at the sign. He doesn't even like go into this little store that is offering like this free whatever. He just takes none of it. And I think the kind of thing I learned from that, watching that, was that you do to an aspect, or to a certain degree, create your own luck. And it's about taking opportunities. And I think if you, in the game of Flesh and Blood, just consider yourself super unlucky, you think, I got unlucky in this, and you never kind of learn from the games, and you just walk away and go, I got unlucky, this happened. You focus on the things that, maybe didn't happen, or I missed this out, or I missed this, as opposed to the things that did happen. This did happen. My opponent did this. I didn't do this in this aspect of the game. I just think people just don't get better. And I think variance is quite low in Flesh and Blood, and if you try and not focus on variance and you focus on the actual things you can impact, you'll get infinitely better at this game quickly.
Yeah, the number one crossover sort of skill or ideology I learned from Flesh and Blood and applied to my life is learn how to play to your outs. And that's
exactly
the fundamental of that is, you do make your own luck, and a mitigation of what people would consider to be unlucky is you're always sort of priced in, right? And you're always just playing to your outs. All right, next question is
spoken like a true Kano player.
Yeah, I know. Kano changes the way you view life, everybody. From Hakai here, and they say, I would like to hear you guys' thoughts on players conceding in the finals of small tier events like Road to Nationals for manipulation of living legend points and prizing. Do you think that these should be played out in their entirety? I don't believe we've seen any of this at higher level events like Callings and Battle Hardens, at least not that I'm aware of. So I picked out this question because I really like the addendum, which is I don't think we've seen this at higher level events like Callings and Battle Hardens. Well, I can assure you this happens at Callings and Battle Hardens. Maybe not concessions, right? It's definitely happened at a Battle Hard. Me and Yuanji conceded the PTI event at Dallas because we just tossed it up because there's no reason to play it at that point. But I know Callings, this has happened like grossly. In the past, doesn't really happen anymore. I do actually believe at a Calling, you're not allowed to do that. I think that you actually do have to play out the match. You can't just concede or chop it. But Hayden, do you think that this should be mitigated in any way? Something like a Road to National because manipulation? I think ultimately it's pretty harmless and players are just going to do it regardless, right? It's pretty hard to police. And if you did police it, you would just end up in the scenario where players were effectively conceding, but they did, for show, they played it out.
It's such a tough question, I think, that because there's a lot of context to all of these different examples that people have of these things happening at events, and people have different thresholds of where they think integrity is kept and not kept. I think the biggest thing is that integrity of the game is really important, and I guess we don't want people bribing people. We don't want people doing favors, basically to throw games. Like that's never something you want in a competitive card game. The best way, as is often said before the end of the last round, the best way to determine a game of Flesh and Blood is to play a game of Flesh and Blood, and it is the correct way to do it. I think let's split this into two things. First of all, the manipulation of living legend points. I think this has been kind of grossly overstated in terms of how much this happened with the Briar piece, because on the flip side it was also the other way around. People were putting out bounties and they were like, people were trying to get Briar to win and all this stuff, so it was happening on both sides. And at a Road to National sort of level, I mean, at any level, I think it's not great because there are, players are there to win their invites to nationals. People are there to play, and for some person in the final, a Road to Nationals final might mean very little. For other people, it's going to mean a lot. And I think integrity of the game is really important. So I think we need to be really careful about those things. And I think judges are aware. And I think there's some communications, as I understand, between judges and the judge program and sort of LSS and rules and policy to make sure that, integrity is kept, whatever that looks like. Prizing, I think that's tough as well because the way that prizing is done, especially at these kind of tier 2 events, Battle Hardens, Road to Nationals, Pro Quests, for instance, is that you're incentivized as a player who's already qualified or is going to qualify to often play because you're going to get the experience of playing. You're going to get the potential elo if that matters to you, but also there's prizes, right? And they are really top heavy, these foils and gold foils, etc. So I think that really incentivizes people to play. Now, a lot of the time that means that the only thing they care about, for instance, is the gold foil. They don't care about the invite. Whereas another person playing on the flip side could only care about the invite and not the gold foil because they haven't got their invite yet. So what does that mean? Well, it's in the best interest of both those players to get the things they want, right? And that's where prize splits starts to happen and things like that, which I think prize splits are okay. My view is that they're okay, but they need to be done within the rules of the game. And I think maybe that's not made clear at events what you can and cannot do. And I've definitely heard some less than desirable things. Ultimately, I think there's got to be some give and take, some leeway to this, but I think a bit of education on what price splitting is versus what bribing is would be really helpful for players.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of prize splitting. I've done it in the past. I've only done it with friends. I've been asked many times and it's snap no. One of the things that I dislike the most, and it happens pretty consistently at very high tier events, so even Pro Tours and Worlds, is the top 8 will actually look to split prior to playing. And I think that it just sucks. I know that on some of those events I've been on the commentary side, so I don't have skin in the game there. But I think that taking stakes out of it's what makes the experience rewarding is, I think, playing for the reward and having some level of risk. I understand that people, a lot of times, they are kind of waging their livelihood. Yeah, they're also waging a bit of livelihood on this. Maybe they can't actually afford to get out there, or eating the opportunity cost of the tournament or not cashing out enough is actually detrimental to their life. But I know that, as a fan of the game, right, I hate it when I hear that. When I hear the top 8 is trying to split and they're waiting on one player to agree to it, it just doesn't feel good. And I don't like it. And who I know hates it more than anybody is James White.
James White.
James,
I
if
know he
you
does.
want to get on James White's bad side, try to split a high level event. He will. He doesn't like it at all, and I understand because it does kind of ruin the game.
Yeah. No, I just want to say I think you're right. I think I kind of downplayed the price spreading a little bit. I think especially at high level events, I guess if it's not correct at high level events, then it's not correct at any level event. And ultimately, what I think probably needs to happen to make sure that people who the invites go to the right people. I think maybe the system in terms of pass downs for ProQuest and Road to Nationals and things like that. Road to Nationals I think works because you have the XP system that, if people eat up Road to Nationals invites in top fours, then that just means more people get on XP. So ultimately you're not eating up invites. Whereas the ProQuest season, 2 players in the final of a ProQuest both already have their invites. You've eaten up an invite, right? And that can be kind of detrimental to local growth, within your local community. And I don't think it should fall on players to be like, well, you shouldn't play so you don't eat up an invite. If there's incentive to play, those players are incentivized to play. Players are, there's grinders out there. So maybe the system needs to change a little bit in that regard. But yeah.
Yeah. I live in a region where there is, locally there's one player that is very dominant at some of these regional events. And I mean, there are people locally that are very unhappy about it. Those players that do end up on the cusp of, in top 8, but can never get their invite. And they are legitimately angry about it. And I think it's fucking stupid. It's like, dude, I mean, if another player is winning, I just think that they deserve to win. Anyway, on to the next one. This is from the Techlo Foundry, or Marco. They say, would Fab benefit from IP crossovers? The strength of the game is the core system that has tangible experience of you being the hero. The attack/block system, the equipment, the class and playstyles offer an immersive experience unlike any other TCGs. Seeing the system brought to other IPs sounds like a fun time that would benefit LSS. Playing the One Ring isn't as flavorful as equipping it to your character. Hayden.
I think would Fab benefit from IP crossovers? I think short term, yeah, it definitely would, right? Like it would bring players to the game. Like you couldn't say that it wouldn't be a short term benefit. Would it be a long term benefit? That's a much harder question to say. I think you look at what's Magic they've done in recent years. They've done D&D, Transformers. They're doing Lord of the Rings now. Yeah. From me personally, that's actually a turn off to the game. I don't enjoy that about Magic. I don't think that's an interesting thing. So from a personal standpoint, and I'm going to put my personal stamp on this to a degree, I don't find it interesting. I think it's a bit of, to me, it looks bad. Like it just looks like a bit of a cash grab to me, which, turns me off the game. I would hate for that to happen with Fab. I think, yes, it could be a benefit to Fab if it was done the right way. Would I want to see it? Not right now and not anytime soon. So.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a little bit of a hypocrite on this one. I also think that overall I have a negative outlook on it, but Magic has dropped some sets and they have done some IP crossovers, like when they did the Warhammer 40K, and I was like, oh, that might be interesting. There's some IPs that have the pull. I think it's because some of them are just so atrociously bad. Like, I'm sorry, I'm just not a fan of Transformers. I see Transformers on a Magic card, I'm like, this is so dumb. Transformers also had its own TCG. Yeah, the Walking, I mean, those were the first, right? That was like, they were egregious because they also looked kind of terrible. I don't know if it's the right move for Fab. Maybe it's relative to being competitive with the other TCGs, but I think that Fab focusing on its own IP and building its own world will pay dividends in the long run, rather than having this sort of, I don't know, all these kind of wacky competing motifs in the game, whether it's another IP or etc. So ultimately, probably not on that one. All right, Hayden, another one from the Techlo Foundry. Should LL points be distributed to heroes and top 8 rather than only to first? The recent change to the LL system mentioned ideal lifespans, ideally 15 to 20 months from release for a high-performing hero and class constructed. But what is a high-performing hero? Is it winner-takes-all approach to the rotation our best option?
We've talked so much about the LL system, and it's funny, I was speaking to James in Singapore, and I said to him, I was like, he was talking about, we were discussing, actually, we were both talking about pace of Heroes Living Legend, of kind of rotation of this next, when I say rotation, I mean Heroes Living Legend, sorry, this next set coming out and the impacts and changes to formats. And I said to James, I said, look, James, I don't actually, James had said to me, he said, I have listened to quite a bit of your content. I've heard the things you've had to say. And I said, interestingly, I said, well, I don't know if you heard that me and Brendan have touched on Living Legend quite a few times, and we've been pretty reasonably sized critics of the Living Legend system. And I did say to James, I think this current iteration of Living Legend does work a lot better, I will be honest. And that is how I feel. Like, I was being honest with James. I think this current iteration of Living Legend is working a lot better. I know people are sitting there going, Briar 998, like, this is an example of how the Living Legend system's failed. I completely disagree. I think it's completely the opposite. That's an example of how Living Legend system is working correctly. I think it's showing that, 998 is it's a bit of an arbitrary number. It could have been 950, right? It could have gone over to 10,020. Like,
yeah,
it's interesting. It's fun to talk about, like, oh, is it going to hit? Is it not going to hit? But ultimately, I think it living through to another season just shows that it hasn't been a dominant hero this past season. It's been pretty poor in terms of what it's done. Now, I think James made a really good point to me. He was like, I'm really interested to see Vincent with Rosetta Thorn and without Rosetta Thorn. And I was like, wow, that is quite interesting. And that is the thing, is that LSS are not in full control of exactly what every format looks like because of Living Legend. And I think that's kind of cool, to be honest. And it gives you the opportunity they can still balance the game. Like they've said always, we will balance the game with the banned and suspended list.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly what they're going to do. Living Legend it can be a part of that, but it really is for heroes that dominate to move through and for the game to get refreshes. We've talked about how important or how impactful Living Legend has been in any given format. Often it's more impactful than the set that comes out. So to be honest, I mean, I know Marco said here about ideally 15 to 20 months from release. High-performing heroes. What is a high-performing hero? I think a high-performing hero is a hero that does well. I guess the critique of this is we lived with Oldham for so long because it didn't win events. Well, it was in top 8s, but it didn't win events.
I think the critique is that Living Legend is ambiguous, and it is. I do think it is an ambiguous system, and I don't think that's. I think that a lot of the issues with Living Legend is people approach it and they look at it from the critique of expecting it to be an exact science, and it's not. Mm-hmm. My biggest critique of Living Legend is that it's not based off dynamic values, so that if the player base expands or contracts drastically, the system fundamentally breaks. Or if events drastically increase or decrease, it doesn't really take in those situations into account. And I think that ultimately, assuming we have linear growth with this game, the system will just have to be changed again, which is fine. If we just move the goalposts a little bit, that's fine. I think ultimately Living Legend has led so far, since its most recent iteration, has led to better iterations of Classic Constructed than we've seen through things like Banner Restricted or releases of new sets. So
yeah, I think just lastly answering Marco's question, I mean, we talked a lot about just Living Legend in general and a few stories there, but should points be given out to top 8? Maybe, but I think the Living Legend system has to go through another change. Like you say, thresholds have to increase. The amount you give to a top 8 has to be super relevant, right? Like a win versus top 8, what's the value of making quarterfinals versus a final? Is it 5x? Is it 10x? So I honestly think that starts to become quite complicated. Also, if you start to give points out to top 8, now you're not talking about domination and sort of what's the word to use, like a high performing hero. Now you're just looking at heroes that are represented highly. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because often, played to top 8 conversion is a lot more reflective than played to win conversion. So yeah, is that right? I don't think so.
I think that there's been some situations where top 8s have been highly representative of a singular hero, but then won by a somewhat less represented hero, and people are like, well, I mean, does this hero really deserve the Living Legend points? I mean, that's just how the system works at this point. I mean,
but also it won. That's more relevant than top 8, I think. A win is more relevant than a top 8.
Agreed.
Because it takes consistency to get to a Living Legend anyway. So I think winning is the pinnacle of that. Mm-hmm. Whether top 8 is correct, maybe, but what I'm saying is winning is definitely correct.
Just take me back to the system where we had the 1 out of 10, irrespective of format, and then you got your name with a little blurb on the website. Those were the days. All right, Hayden, this one comes from Thomas WBG. They say, with Monarch Draft returning, which card do you think was the most undervalued during the release season? Or let's take this question in a different direction. Which card do you think is the most undervalued just in Monarch Draft?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I was taking the question anyway, I think. That is a great question. The card that's most undervalued. I mean, there's a card that I was talking to, I was talking to Nick, actually. We were at a draft on Thursday, recent guest on the pod. And one of the cards that we talked about was, Health and Beyond. That card is really powerful. And I think the perception is that card is not actually that powerful, but it's a rare. The card, I've seen some dirty stuff happen with that card. I think that card could be in the consideration. Or honestly, it might just be like a generic common in the form
Mhm.
of something like we know everyone knows how good the poppers are, right? Everyone talks about poppers are really strong. You need them because of how strong Prism is in the format. But then there's also like the yellow versions of those cards are also a lot better than people give them credit for. Like yellow pound for pound is a win condition in this game.
Mhm.
Yellow Stony Wootenhog can be a 2 card for 6. Yellow Surging Militia is also
Yeah.
really strong. Yellow Zealous Belting. So I think some of I would say the yellows of cards in generic particular are really underrated, I think, in Monarch.
Yeah, for me, I'll say the name of this card, and Hayden's going to be like, "That's not underrated." But I think on aggregate, it is still underrated, and that's Surging Militia. I just think the Surging Militia is one of the best cards in Monarch Draft, and like it's so hard to deal with. It attacks from multiple angles. I think heading into the modern era of what will be Monarch Draft, people are going to be prioritizing that card higher than they did in the past. To answer sort of the original question there, which was most undervalued during release.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
I'll agree with you.
I'm just looking here. This is from OB Woodland J. Sorry, it was a hard name to read. Question for the next pod. Is LSS scared to make strong heroes? It seems like ever since Starvo, LSS hasn't made heroes of the same power level as Chain, Prism, Briar, etc. Is it just them getting better at balancing and designing heroes, or are they just too timid or worried about having another Starvo situation? This is a really good question. The trade-off of power and what some people perceived, or what some people would probably label as fun. The heroes are a bit more balanced nowadays. You're doing less busted stuff, right? Now you're drawing your entire deck. You are like a Chain. You're not locking people out of the board like you were with Prism, and you're not winning the game in deck building and have that and not playing the game at all like you were with Starvo, or some people might say. What do you think, Hayden?
It's a great question because I think it's all relative.
Yeah.
Like had more powerful heroes been printed, then the question would be on the flip side. But they haven't. I think people always have complaints about certain heroes and formats. I think at the time when Fi got printed, people were like, Fi, this is just another hero where LSS have missed the mark, the power level's too high. But I think looking back, people aren't saying that now, right? People aren't with the Briar errata, even after the errata, people were like, Briar's too strong. Where do people sit on that now? It's always relative to the format, I think. In saying that, Starvo and Chain, Prism, I agree. The play experience, the power level of the card pool, plus the hero, etc., very, very high. I don't think they're scared to make heroes at their power level. I think they actively don't want to. But the other thing as well was that, and James explained this as well when I was speaking to him, and I've heard him explain it on different things, and Brennan, you spoke about it as well. He said at Baltimore, is this ebb and kind of these peaks?
I was going to ask. I was going to say,
Yeah.
What about what James has been saying? Because he's talking about this. He's like, there are peaks and valleys, and he kind of alluded that we were in a valley. So does that mean we're coming back to a peak in terms of doing busted stuff?
Potentially. To what level it is, I mean, I think this, and I can speak, again, this is speculation, but I'm like super, super confident that this is the case, is that LSS looked at Monarch and Tales of Aria and went too powerful. They're like the power level we've gotten to and the gameplay experience is not where we want it to be, and even with Everfest, and we have come into that value. I think next time we get to a peak in power level, it won't be quite at the same level. That is, I feel fairly confident that's going to be the case. But, like power creep to a degree has to come in somewhere, and it doesn't come from the basic design of cards, because those like cards are pretty tied to, I guess, the values of how this game is designed, the design principles. So heroes is often where that comes from. And I think that's okay.
Yeah.
I think it's okay.
I think we kind of talked about in the pod with Nick Butcher, by the way, last week, that it does feel like some of the power creep is coming from blues, right? Blues that function as premier resource cards, but also are very, very serviceable threats in the late game. Makes like heroes that have access to those kind of resource cards feel like they're a cut above some of the other heroes right now. We've gone through different iterations throughout the history of Fab, where at one point we were talking about some heroes have fridges and others don't, and that feels like a huge disparity, right? Like it feels like it's almost a non-starter to have a hero without a fridge. Now we're looking at things like Oldhim that had these very, very solid blues. So I don't know. It's just an interesting conversation as Fab continues to evolve.
There's more than that, though. I mean, weapons has been a conversation. Rosetta Thorn, for instance, Winter's Wail, like those are also the sort of things that people spoke about in that same sort of vein. And repeatable threats. That was something we talked, Drone of Brutality back in the day was the same sort of conversation. So I think the conversation always changes. Right now, it's about the kind of power level of resource cards, I think in particular. But that could very quickly shift to the power level of the heroes in general. It could change to weapons. It could change to equipment. I think Crucible of War in particular was equipment, right?
Yeah.
So sets will change this dynamic of the conversation, and heroes is just one part of that puzzle.
All right, last one. This is from Fab Unofficial. They say, it wasn't really touched on too much, but what is both of your personal favorite end games of decks you played with in the past? This is off the back of the podcast we did on navigating end games.
That's a great question. I mean, I think you should take this one first because I feel like you've got a home run lined up for yourself.
No, I just think the funnest, for me, the one that's been the most enjoyable, has had the most input to output in terms of like you put in the work, you reap the reward. I mean, it really just was Chain, and nobody's gonna. I don't think any hero in the future will ever be able to take that away from me or even us to an extent, because there was a very decent amount of time where I felt like we were significantly ahead of the curve, and actually the general populace disagreed with us, right? Like when things like Snag came up, Flock of the Featherwalkers came up, like we continued to stick with our version of that deck build, and we saw consistent success over and over and over again. And that end game was so mentally taxing, and some of the theory and the math we had done beforehand on deck sizes and getting to the right pitch stack, it was a very cathartic, rewarding experience in the end when we got to pull that off. Also, we got to, break the rules of Fab, and you see Dante Delfico on camera count his deck 50 times, and you're like, this should not be legal. It's the funniest thing. It's the biggest meme from, if anybody's played Chain, and you guys will see this. This will happen in Monarch Limited, which is, it's funny because if you pilot Chain, you will run into this scenario. You will sequence count your deck, which is, you don't count the actual number. You just count 1, 2, 3, 4. Your cards you draw, then the number shackle, cards again. And when you do that, your opponent will ask you how many cards, and you'll respond with, I don't know.
I don't know. I have no clue. You count. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point. Do you know what? I agree on Chain. This might be a recency bias, but the in-game for Ultim in this previous format was very interesting and quite enjoyable to navigate, particularly mirror matches. It was very complex. It was about specific cards in deck. It was about pitch order and about what hands were going to come up and how you navigated taking the kind of Terra Sunder tempo in the in-game, depending on where you were in the game and depending on what's been defended with. This is also like, you saw this, like we saw things like Dramai and stuff as well. Like Ultim has really interesting in-games. I think that particularly came up in this most recent format, more so than some other formats. But I do agree on Chain. And the other one that I'll just give a quick shout out for sort of favorite in-games was the Viserai sort of in-game. In the Scalata build, but when you didn't play the combo, when you played more of a mini setup kind of game, which was quite interesting.
My favorite end game was actually, it's the Blitz Viserai. It starts as soon as the game starts. We're in the end game combo. There's been, that's honestly, I know you've sort of recaptured the experience with Oldham, but I hope that future hero design will allow us to sort of revisit those sort of really grandiose end game strategies where they do start from the beginning of the game. And there's something about Chain with the banishing and what felt like drawing your entire deck on the final turn. It was it's an experience we haven't been able to replicate quite yet for me. Anyway, Hayden, do you want any questions you want to end with here, maybe coming from you personally before we close out for the week?
Not particularly. I think there's been a great range of questions that have come through. I thought there was one question that you were going to ask that came from a certain someone that you didn't end up asking. But just want to say thank you to everyone for the questions. A little bit short notice on the, I guess, Q&A. So please, if you do have questions, do get them in. We will pop them on the pod in the Commander Cookout section. That's for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Well, if you're listening to this on pod platforms, there is a video version on YouTube at youtube.com/ArsenalPass. Hayden and I are both on Twitter at Brendan APG. Hayden is at Fien_Dale. If you want to help out the podcast, if you've been listening to us for, God, who knows, 2 years by now, leave us a review. That's by far the most helpful thing you can do. Apple Podcast is preferred. But if not, you can go to ratethispodcast.com/ArsenalPass. And I'll give you all the links you need to sort of figure that out. Outside of that, check out the Patreon if you want to see up-to-date deck techs and deck guides. We'll have stuff in the lead up to World Championships, whenever the heck that is. And I'll keep saying that until they announce. And then, of course, support helps us out immensely. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
See you later.